Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to jump right into a case that's just, well, it's one of those that grabs you and just doesn't let go. The 1954 murder of Marilyn Sheppard.
Yeah.
And we have a ton of great research and articles that you guys have sent in, and honestly, this one is a wild ride. So get ready to explore the story of Dr. Sam Sheppard, a man caught in a web of suspicion, media frenzy, and 2 trials for the murder of his pregnant wife.
It really is a fascinating case, and as you said, a wild one. But I think what makes this case so compelling is that it goes way beyond just a whodunit. It's really a deep dive into how the media, public opinion, and the legal system, how all of those things can just collide and create, well, chaos. And the Sheppard case, it became almost like a landmark example of how these forces can just completely derail the pursuit of justice.
Okay, so let's set the scene for our listeners. It's the 4th of July weekend, 1954. We're in Bay Village, a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, and we have Dr. Sam Sheppard, his wife Marilyn, and their young son, Chip. Picture perfect, all-American family, right? But that picture gets shattered, and I mean brutally shattered, on the morning of July 4th.
Yeah, absolutely brutal. That morning, the Sheppard's neighbor stumbles upon just a horrifying scene. Marilyn is dead. She was brutally beaten in their home, and immediately suspicion falls on Dr. Sheppard. But like we were saying, things are not as straightforward as they might seem at first glance.
Right from the get-go, there are these weird details that just don't really make sense. Like Dr. Sheppard, he claims he was knocked unconscious by an intruder during some kind of struggle.
Yeah.
He even describes seeing a quote-unquote form attacking Marilyn. But get this, there's absolutely no sign of forced entry.
Yeah, and that's only the beginning. It gets even more interesting. So some of Dr. Sheppard's belongings, we're talking his watch, his keys, they're recorded missing initially. But then later, they're found hidden in the yard. Oh, and one more thing. The family dog. Didn't bark, not a sound. So it really makes you wonder, right, was this like a genuine fight, a struggle, or was it somehow staged, to mislead investigators?
I mean, it's like we're talking about a plot from a thriller novel.
Yeah.
But what really takes this case beyond your typical crime story is the absolute media frenzy that just erupts around it.
Oh, the media, for sure. They had a field day, especially the Cleveland press. They played a massive role in how the public viewed this case. Just think about it. Headlines like, "Quit stalling and bring him in." I mean, that kind of aggressive coverage, it puts a ton of pressure on law enforcement, and it likely swayed the public against Dr. Sheppard. And this was all before he even stepped foot in a courtroom.
It's a perfect example of what we talk about a lot, trial by media. And in this case, that trial began long before any official legal proceedings. And it wasn't just newspapers either. Radio broadcasts, oh boy, they just added more fuel to that fire. There were shows featuring this woman claiming to be Dr. Sheppard's mistress, saying he had a motive, that he wanted Marilyn out of the picture. And you know what? Some of the jurors even admitted to hearing those broadcasts.
See, and that's the real danger. That's when the media starts seeping into what's supposed to be, an impartial legal process. It's almost like the case became a battleground, not just about determining guilt or innocence, but about understanding how information and even misinformation can influence how we see justice.
So let's move on to that first trial. What were the biggest points the prosecution made? What did they really hammer on to build their case against Dr. Sheppard?
Well, the prosecution, they painted a very specific picture of Dr. Sheppard. They presented him as a man with secrets, a man with a motive. They brought up these alleged affairs to suggest that he was unhappy in his marriage. And they combined that with, well, the lack of other suspects and what they perceived as inconsistent behavior from Dr. Sheppard after Marilyn's murder. Basically, they were weaving this narrative, a story of a husband driven to, a desperate, terrible act.
So it sounds like they were really trying to create this very specific image of Dr. Sheppard for the jury. They were using his personal life to try to bolster their case. But how did the defense push back against all of that?
Well, the defense, they argue that Dr. Sheppard wasn't some cunning killer. Instead, they said he was another victim in this whole tragedy. They really emphasized the extent of his injuries. They even brought in medical experts to testify that his injuries were consistent with being attacked. They weren't self-inflicted.
So they were challenging the physical evidence, suggesting that it actually supported Dr. Sheppard's claim that he was attacked as well.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They also pointed to things like, the blood spatter patterns. They argued that those patterns didn't match up with Dr. Sheppard being the attacker. And then there's this strange detail, and it's a big one, about Marilyn's missing teeth. The defense proposed that during the struggle, she bit her attacker. And since Dr. Sheppard didn't have any bite marks, Well, that strongly suggested that someone else was involved.
It sounds like they were really trying to break apart the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. So with all of that, were they able to convince the jury?
Sadly, no, at least not in that first trial. The jury found Dr. Sheppard guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. But that verdict, that wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. Things take a major turn when the Supreme Court gets involved.
Okay, this is where things get really, really interesting. The Supreme Court, I mean, that changes everything. So what was their reasoning for overturning the initial guilty verdict?
The Supreme Court, in a landmark 8-1 decision, ruled that the media frenzy, they said it had basically poisoned any chance of Dr. Sheppard getting a fair trial. They called the whole thing, and I'm quoting here, a mockery of justice. They were pointing to all that pervasive and completely prejudicial coverage that had basically taken over the public's perception of the case.
Wow, I mean, that's a huge win for Dr. Sheppard, and it's a really powerful statement from the highest court in the land about how important a fair trial is. So a retrial is ordered, and what happens this time around?
Well, this time, the court takes steps to try to minimize the media's influence. They sequester the jury, which means they're completely shielded from the outside world, from all those opinions and speculations flying around. Both the prosecution and the defense, they mostly stick to their original arguments, but there are some key differences this time.
I bet the defense was ready for round two, ready to come back with a much stronger strategy. What were some of the changes they made for the retrial?
They really got the chance to, I guess you could say, dissect the prosecution's case. They were able to cross-examine witnesses in a much more thorough way, maybe pointing out inconsistencies or just raising some doubts about their testimony. This time, they had the opportunity to present a much stronger, much more robust defense of Dr. Sheppard.
It sounds like it was a much more balanced legal battle the second time around.
Hmm.
So what was the outcome of this second trial?
After days of deliberation, the jury finally reaches a verdict. Not guilty. Dr. Sheppard is acquitted. But even with this legal victory, even after being cleared by the court, public opinion remained very, very divided. There was still that shadow of suspicion hanging over him.
But I think that really shows how much this case resonated with people and how difficult it can be to separate what's true from what we perceive as true, even when a court of law has made a decision. But the story doesn't end there. What happened to Dr. Sheppard after he was finally acquitted?
Well, you'd think he might want to just, fade back into a quiet life, right? But instead, he makes a really surprising move. He actually steps into the world of professional wrestling.
Wait, hold on. Professional wrestling. That's pretty wild. Tell me more about this killer Sam Sheppard persona.
Yeah, he basically leaned right into the public's fascination with the whole case. He became Killer Sam Sheppard. He even came up with this signature wrestling move called the mandibular nerve pinch. It was like he was using his medical knowledge for, well, a very different kind of purpose.
It's both bizarre and kind of amazing. It's almost like he was taking back his own narrative. He was using this public persona to confront all the notoriety that had followed him for years and years. But sadly, Dr. Sheppard's life took a tragic turn in the years that followed. What happened? It's like all the stress, all the trauma, it just kind of caught up with him.
Yeah, sadly, you're right. Even though he was acquitted, Dr. Sheppard's life, it wasn't peaceful at all. He really struggled with alcoholism, and that really sabotaged any attempts he made to, rebuild his medical career. It's tragic, really. His addiction led to fatal errors during surgeries, and he was eventually forced to resign.
It's just heartbreaking to think that even after proving his innocence in court, even after all that, he just couldn't escape the shadow of those accusations and the personal demons that they unleashed. It's a really devastating turn of events.
It is. And I think it reminds us that the impact of a case like this, it goes way beyond just the courtroom. We're talking about real human beings here, the toll it takes, the scars it leaves, and the struggle to put your life back together after being shattered by suspicion and public scrutiny. And then, of course, there's his son, Chip. He grows up with this as his reality.
Yeah, Chip Sheppard, he was just a little boy when his mother was murdered. And he never wavered in his belief that his father was innocent. It's amazing to think about the strength and resilience he must have had to carry that burden for so many years. So what did Chip do? What did he do to try to clear his father's name?
Well, Chip dedicated his life to uncovering the truth about what happened. Years later, he filed a lawsuit against the state of Ohio alleging wrongful conviction. He wasn't just fighting for his father's memory, he was challenging the system that he believed had failed his family.
It's almost like he was picking up where his father left off, continuing the fight for justice. So What kind of evidence did he present in this lawsuit?
Well, Chip, he was able to bring forward new evidence that just wasn't available back in the 1950s. The most significant was blood analysis, and this analysis suggested that there was a third person at the crime scene. It was almost like he was using these advancements in science to challenge the narrative that had been created all those years ago.
It really is fascinating how technology can completely change our understanding of past events. So, did Chip's lawsuit? Did it succeed? Did it change the official story of the case?
Well, while the lawsuit itself didn't result in a legal victory, the jury ultimately concluded that the original arrest wasn't malicious or improper, but his efforts did bring renewed attention to the case, and they cast further doubt on the original investigation. It's a testament to his unwavering dedication to seeking justice for his father.
Yeah, even though he didn't get the legal outcome he was hoping for, Chip's efforts definitely kept this case alive in the public eye, and they made people reassess the evidence. So we have Dr. Sheppard acquitted in the retrial, and his son, Chip, tirelessly fighting to clear his name. But the big question remains, if not Dr. Sheppard, then who killed Marilyn?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's the question that has haunted this case for decades. Investigators did look at other suspects, but none of them were ever scrutinized as thoroughly as Dr. Sheppard. Maybe the most interesting of these alternative suspects was a guy named Richard Eberling. He was a window washer who had worked at the Sheppard's house.
Okay, so what made Eberling a suspect?
Well, Eberlin had a bit of a, let's say, a troubled past. He had a history of theft, and he'd even admitted to stealing from the Sheppards before. But he always maintained his innocence when it came to Marilyn's murder. However, years later, DNA evidence linked him to another murder. And that raised some serious questions about his potential role in Marilyn's death.
It's chilling to think that the real killer might have escaped justice while an innocent man was imprisoned and scrutinized by the public for years. Why wasn't Eberling investigated more seriously back then?
It's hard to say for sure. Maybe the intense media focus on Dr. Sheppard created a kind of tunnel vision for the investigators. They became so fixated on him as the main suspect that they just overlooked other possibilities.
So after all these years, countless investigations, 2 trials, and a son's unwavering pursuit of the truth, the murder of Marilyn Sheppard is still officially unsolved. It's a harsh reminder that sometimes, even when we try our best, justice can be really elusive.
It really is. And the Sheppard case, it serves as a powerful reminder that truth and perception, they're often intertwined. Unraveling those two things can be a long and incredibly difficult process. It forces us to question what we think we know, to challenge the stories we're told, and to consider all the possibilities when we're looking for justice.
It also highlights how the justice system can be influenced by, well, by media frenzy and public opinion, which is a scary thought. The Sheppard case is a cautionary tale. It urges us to look at cases like this with a critical eye and to demand fairness and a thorough investigation every step of the way.
Absolutely. The Sheppard case, it's a stark reminder of how important due process is, and unbiased investigations, and a justice system that's free from outside pressure. It's a case that should make us all think about how fragile justice can be and how crucial it is to make sure it prevails, even when it faces huge challenges.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive, we find ourselves back where we started, facing the same questions that have lingered for decades. Was Dr. Sheppard truly innocent? Was he a victim of circumstance and a media storm that just wouldn't quit? Or was he a cunning manipulator who managed to outsmart the justice system and escape being held accountable for a horrible crime?
And what about Richard Eberling? Could he be the key to solving this whole thing? Is he the one who holds the answers to Marilyn Sheppard's murder? Or is there another possibility out there? Someone completely unknown to the investigation, lurking in the shadows of this mystery.
It's like we've been working on this huge puzzle, but we're still missing some of the most important pieces.
And that's what keeps us coming back to these kinds of cases, even after all this time. That drive to understand, to find those missing pieces, to try to find some kind of closure, even when it feels impossible.
Yeah, we've talked about the trials, the media circus, all the twists and turns of the investigation. But what about the human side of it all? What does the Sheppard case tell us about ourselves? About how we see justice, how we deal with not knowing for sure?
Well, it reminds us that we all come to these stories with our own baggage, our own ideas, shaped by our experiences, what we believe, and the information we choose to pay attention to. The Sheppard case, it challenges us to face those biases head on, to admit that we don't know everything, and to be open to the possibility that the truth might be way more complicated than we first thought.
It also shows the power of a good story, right? Think about how the media portrayed Dr. Sheppard, how the prosecution presented their case. It wasn't just about the facts, it was about creating a narrative that people would latch onto, a story that played on our fears and our desire for justice.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to be aware of how those narratives are built, to question where our information is coming from, and to look for different perspectives. The Shepherd case, it's like a lesson in media literacy. It reminds us that we're not just sitting back and absorbing information. We have to think critically about the stories we're being told.
So all these years later, what are the lasting implications of the Shepherd case? Why should we still care about a murder that happened over 70 years ago?
Because it shows us how fragile our justice system really is. It's a warning about jumping to conclusions too quickly, about how bias can sneak into investigations and trials, and how important it is to remember that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, even when the public is screaming for a conviction.
It also shows how much forensic science has changed. Imagine if Chip Shepherd had had access to that DNA analysis back in the 1950s. It could have completely changed everything.
It's crazy to think about how new technology can change how we see old cases. It might even reveal things that were hidden before. And it makes you wonder if we should be re-examining old cases as technology gets better and we learn more about forensics.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive, and we're still left with the same question. Who killed Marilyn Sheppard?
We've looked at the evidence against Dr. Sheppard, we've talked about other suspects like Richard Eberling, and we've even considered the possibility that the real killer is still out there, someone we haven't even heard of.
Now it's your turn, listener. Weigh the evidence, think about the different possibilities, and come to your own conclusions. Do you think Dr. Sheppard was wrongly accused? A victim of bad luck and a media frenzy that spun out of control?
Or do you think he was a clever manipulator who got away with murder?
Maybe you're leaning towards another suspect, like Eberling. Or maybe you think there's something else going on entirely, something we haven't even thought of.
Whatever you decide, the Sheppard case forces us to ask tough questions, to challenge our assumptions, and to accept that finding justice is rarely easy.
This deep dive has been a journey, that's for sure. A journey through a tangled mess of evidence, theories, and human drama. We've explored the legal system, the power of the media, the constantly changing world of forensic science, and the enduring mystery of a murder that captivated the nation.
And we hope this deep dive has made you want to keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep that critical thinking going strong. The Sheppard case shows us that the search for truth never really ends. And sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
Until next time, keep diving deep.